The PlayStation 1 was released during an era of developers trying to figure things out. 3D in video games was quickly becoming the standard, and many studios had to adapt to the changes that were coming with it. A lot of them managed to do this pretty well. You know, we got Crash Bandicoot, Metal Gear Solid, both being great games that effectively utilized their 3D space. Sometimes developers opted out of 3D and gave us other great experiences like Symphony of the Night. Then there were those who tried to work with this new technology but didn't quite hit the mark. Out of this, we got games like Rascal and the infamous Bubsy 3D. But no matter the circumstances, the end result would always undoubtedly be something interesting to look back on and talk about. The PS1 era is, in my opinion, one of the most interesting in gaming history. It was that transitional period between 2D and 3D, and with it came experimentation, innovation, and of course, a lot of missteps. Regardless though, it was an era of pure creativity. And that's not to discredit modern games either. Creativity does and always will exist in the video game industry, you just need to know where to look for it. And in this video, that's exactly what we're gonna do. I've amassed 10 completely random, obscure fighting games for the PlayStation 1. Keep in mind that some are gonna be more obscure than others, you very well may have heard of at least a few of these. I'm gonna play all of them in no particular order and give my general thoughts on each one. Why did I specifically pick fighting games? I have no idea, I was just kind of in the mood to play some. It's also important to note that I am not an authority on fighting games in any capacity, so bear with me, I'm gonna try to provide information as accurately as I'm capable of. So with that out of the way, let's take a look at our first game. Starting off with a game that's actually a bit more well-known, Battle Arena Toshinden was the first fighting game for the PS1 and is credited as the first 3D fighter to implement a sidestep. It was a launch title in North America, releasing on September 9th, 1995. And wow, you can really tell. Movement feels pretty stiff, with character animations that suggest the act of fighting. It's definitely pretty dated visually, but I've actually read some testimonies from people saying it was pretty mind-blowing at the time. And I sincerely don't doubt that. Having a game like this on a home console in 3D was probably a very novel concept in 1995. The controls are pretty typical, consisting of 2 light attacks and 2 heavy attacks. I found they could be a bit unresponsive though. It didn't happen super often, but there were moments where I'd try to input a special and the game either didn't register it or thought I was trying to do a sidestep. Believe it or not though, you can actually perform some rudimentary combos, since some normals can be cancelled with a special. It's not quite as freeform as a modern fighting game, but it's cool that the option exists regardless. The 3D implementation is light, but honestly effective. The sidestep is a very good dodge maneuver, as it can land you behind an opponent's back where you'll get some extra damage if you manage to hit it. I think this is the most satisfying thing about this game. Watching that health bar tick down as you get a big counter hit feels unexpectedly pretty good. Unfortunately, sometimes the camera can't quite keep up with your movements, so it leads to really awkward moments where it ends up behind one person. I don't know if this was intentional or not, it's just kind of weird. You can also push opponents out of the ring, but I find that a lot of the stages are a bit too big, so it's not usually something that either person triggers intentionally. Content as well is pretty light, as expected for a launch title. The only 2 game modes are arcade mode and versus, so you'd better get used to fighting that final boss a lot. The reward for beating it isn't too bad though. Once you do so and get through the unskippable credits, the game tells you the button combination for your character's super. That's a pretty sick way of encouraging replaying the game with different characters, even if it's only a one-time reward. Overall, Battle Arena Toshinden is a bit clunky, a bit janky, definitely pretty dated, but it's also extremely charming. I mean it, I actually did get some enjoyment playing through this game. To me, it's a completely harmless venture into the past, a cute time capsule of a game. There's not really a reason to go back to it now, but if you do, you'll have at least a decent time. Next up is Zero Divide, which was also a launch title in North America. Wait, this was a launch title? Dude, if people had their minds blown by the last game, I think this would have straight up killed them. It's really impressive graphically, the animations are really smooth, and the combat has so much weight. The character designs as well, they're both distinct and very outlandish. And I really do mean outlandish, like why is this robot so caked. Powerful man kickers aside, this game feels very reminiscent of Tekken, albeit much simpler with only 2 attack buttons and a guard. The combat has a very heavy emphasis on movement and performing mix-ups to outplay your opponent. It feels really good to play overall. Attacks feel like they have so much force behind them. This game boasts a few unique ideas, like the limb damage system. As you fight, parts of the portrait will start to change color, indicating that that body part has been injured. The more injured it is, the higher the damage will be if you take another hit there. This is cool. You can plan entire fights around just this system alone. It makes for a very tense game, since winning the neutral can put either you or an opponent severely on the back foot. Similar to Toshinden, you can also wring your opponent out, but it's much more fleshed out in Zero Divide. When you're pushed off the arena, your character grabs onto the ledge, and from there you have multiple ways of getting yourself back up. I think this is a great addition to the formula. It adds a bit more depth and balance, as it's no longer a way to instantly win the round. Knockdowns in this game are also very unique. If you're knocked down, then you can't simply just tech the fall. You have to be on the ground for a set amount of time that can be sped up by mashing buttons. Once the meter under your health is full, you'll automatically stand up and have access to a few different get-up options. This system is in place so that you can attack a grounded opponent, but there's always a bit of risk to using it. If you happen to miss, your opponent will probably get up and punish you. It's yet another little thing that serves to add more depth and strategy to the overall experience. I'm honestly very impressed by this game. I think my biggest complaint is that characters could be a bit more fleshed out. The movesets are a tad limited, and it's because of that you tend to fall back on a lot of the same attack strings, which can damage variety a little bit. Another problem I encountered is the AI. It's absolutely relentless. I mean, it's doable once you learn more about the game, but man, I struggled for a while. I was playing on normal too, give me a break! I mean, I eventually beat the final boss, and now the game is asking me to play it again, but on hard? I mean, I went ahead and did it anyway. It honestly wasn't too bad the second time around, but this is definitely one of those practice makes perfect kind of games, which makes me wish it had an actual practice mode, but oh well, it was 1995. I'd say Zero Divide is pretty good. It doesn't have quite the level of depth as something like Tekken, but I do quite like it. I'd even go as far as to call it Diet Tekken, which honestly isn't a bad thing. It's a shame this series never went anywhere. I'm sure it could have evolved into something truly special if they kept going with it. Following Zero Divide, we have Rival Schools, which was developed by Capcom for arcades in 1997 and released the following year on PlayStation 1. I've heard this game be described as a cousin to Street Fighter, and I can definitely see the comparison. Two noticeable differences are that this game has 4 attack buttons instead of 6 and is played in 3D. Right out of the gate, this game controls amazing. Everything is extremely snappy and responsive, executing combos feels great, there was never a moment where I didn't feel completely in control. Before each match, you're prompted to select 2 characters, a main fighter and a partner. Even though the fights are one-on-one, you're free to switch characters in between each round, whether you won or lost. By pressing 2 attack buttons of the same strength, you can perform what is called a team-up technique. This changes depending on what character you have on standby. Some team-up techniques are high-damaging attacks, while others are buffs to your main fighter. There are a ton of different character combinations to try here. It's a game with an incredible amount of variety, and that's just choosing your character. The combat is also surprisingly meaty. Every character has access to universal 3-hit combos, but depending on your fighter's moveset, they can be extended in a variety of ways. My favorite of which is a launcher, which in itself can be either comboed off of or ended with a super. Offensive options are varied enough to keep the combat engaging, but not so overwhelming that you can't learn characters as you play. A healthy balance was definitely struck here. But if you just want to learn a character's moveset, there's actually a practice mode. And man, I'm really glad this is here. It's something that a lot of early fighting games unfortunately kind of lack. Anyway, aside from robust attacking options, the game has some defensive techniques as well. If you input a heavy, special, or super while you're blocking, your block is cancelled and you perform what is called a tardy counter. If your opponent is backing you into a corner with relentless pressure, you can perform one of these for a quick way to turn the tables. It's fairly similar to alpha counters from the Street Fighter Alpha series, although it's much more lenient in Rival Schools. This game also features a rewarding sidestep mechanic. If you perform one as an opponent is about to connect an attack, your character will dodge out of the way and reposition behind their back. This basically gives you a free combo or super. It's pretty balanced though. If you mistime a sidestep, you could just get yourself into even deeper trouble. Is there anything I'd say is wrong with this game? I'd say the lack of game modes hurts it a little bit. I mean, you only have arcade mode and versus, that's it. Unless you count practice mode, but once you know the game, you won't really have a reason to use it that much. Other than that though, man, this is a good game. It might not be as complex as other fighters, but honestly, I don't think every game needs to be. As someone who enjoys fighting games from a fairly casual perspective, I think Rival Schools could be a fantastic entry point for people wanting to get more into them. It's complex enough to be interesting, but not overwhelming. The combat feels good, there's lots of characters to choose from, it looks great for the time, it's not too difficult to learn, there's so much here to enjoy. This might be one of the most underrated PS1 games I think I've ever played, hands down. So like most of the other games so far, I knew nothing going into this one, and it ended up being way different than I expected. I don't really know if you could classify it as a fighting game by today's standards, but I decided to throw it in here because it was really fun regardless. Released in 1997 and developed by Square of all companies, Bushido Blade is a 3D fighter that focuses on realism above all else. There's no health bars, meters, specials, supers, not even any music during the matches. It's just you, your opponent, and the fight at hand. Pushing the concept of realism further is its one-shot mechanic. You take a hit to any vital area of your body and that's it, you're dead. All of the combat is done using bladed weapons, so yeah. You probably don't need a medical doctorate to presume that having a sword plunged into your forehead would probably be detrimental to your health. Attacking any of the opponent's limbs will disable the usage of them and heavily limit their moveset. For a PlayStation 1 game, concepts like this are very forward-thinking. I always have respect for games that can toss out a genre's established conventions and instead do something completely unique. Even now, I can't really think of another fighting game that's so non-game-like, but it still manages to be enjoyable to play, tying its central focus into every other aspect of its design. The combat, for example, is really fleshed out and deliberate. Like Rival Schools, it sits pretty comfortably on that median of giving you a lot of options, but not being too overwhelming to learn either. You have 3 attack buttons: triangle for attacking high, circle for attacking mid, and X for attacking low. These can be chained together to create longer attack strings by a series of inputs, with each weapon having a unique moveset. Pressing square will initiate a timed block that acts as a parry of sorts. Using this can be a bit risky, however. If your character's strength isn't equal to or greater than your opponent's, it will stagger you instead. Alongside your basic attacks, you can also change between 3 different stances that all have their own movesets. Some weapons are better in certain stances than others, but more advanced players will find a way to make use of all 3. The selectable characters once again take all these concepts a little bit further. Some of them are fast, while others are powerful, and each has a couple preferred weapons that grant them exclusive attacks. Every character can use every weapon though, so if you want to play someone that is fast, for example, but still prefer a specific moveset, then you can do that. All of this comes together to craft an experience that is tense, engaging, complex, and rewarding. Every little decision you make during a match can spell disastrous consequences for either you or your opponent. The entire game is built around trying to outplay the other person. It's sincerely so much fun. There's a pretty decent chunk of content here too. Obviously, you have your standard story and versus modes, but you also have slash mode. In this mode, you'll be facing a series of increasingly challenging enemies, with a checkpoint once every 10 kills. This one was a lot of fun to play. After the completion of this video, I look forward to going back and trying to complete it. You also have training mode, which is always appreciated. And then there's the game mode that stands out the most to me, POV. This completely flips the game's perspective into first person. I was kind of blown away when I first saw this. It definitely isn't something I just expected them to throw in there as a secondary game mode. This is just sick. I don't know why they did this, but I'm not gonna complain about it either. And that's Bushido Blade, a game that honestly left me wildly impressed. It's satisfying to learn, fun to play, and has an incredibly unique concept that I would love to see expanded upon in a modern game. Here we have Fighter Maker, a game that was developed and published by ASCII Entertainment in 1998. Ooh, that is a really bad title screen. All of the UI design is incredibly unappealing to look at in general. Oh, the character designs too, they're so painfully generic. They clearly just told the artists like, hey, can you draw a popular character and then change them up slightly so we don't get sued? Like, that's clearly just Albert Wesker. That's Polnareff from JoJo. Terry Bogard? Oh, they weren't even trying to hide it. And of course, you have Guile too. It's not a real fighting game unless you put Guile in there. Oh my god, the combat is so bad. You can just mash buttons. It's really not complicated or interesting. There's no jump either? Seriously? I think this is about as bare bones a fighting game can legally be before it's considered a prototype. And I found an infinite combo like 3 seconds into playing the game. You can't be serious, guys. This game does not play well. Combat in general feels less like punching someone and more like hitting them with a toilet paper roll. There's no voice acting, everything looks really flat and ugly, the music is awful, and it cuts to the credits so abruptly I get the impression that this game doesn't even want to exist. Okay, so that should probably be enough to establish that this game isn't very good. But there is one thing about it that initially interested me. Now, the game is called Fighter Maker because of its character creation system. At first, I thought that meant like customizing a fighter, changing their outfit, maybe their attacks, hair, face, skin color, you know, like any other character creator. That wasn't quite the case, but you can customize information on each fighter that you make, so here's mine. Name, Evil Man. Hometown, Chicago. Hobby, schoolyard bullying. Occupation, loving husband. Fighting style, illegal animal hunting. So if you can't create a character in the traditional sense, then what can you do? Well, this. At first, I had literally no idea what to make of any of this. But as it turns out, they want you to manually animate all of your character's movements frame by frame. I am not kidding. They basically just repackaged a developer tool and said, here, that's a selling feature now. Make the entire game yourself, fuckhead. I'm sorry, I want to find this cool as a concept, but can you seriously expect the average consumer to have enough animation knowledge to make something good? The game tries to make this less janky by interpolating the movement between your created frames, and that's something that is genuinely helpful. But this just takes so unbelievably long to use! I don't have the time or the patience for this! So I made a guy that does this when he runs instead. I thought it'd be funny. You can also mess with any character's pre-made animations with absolutely no restrictions. You guys shouldn't have let me do that though, because I just took the guy that could combo infinitely and then did this to him. I'm sorry, this game is a complete mess. Let's take a quick break, you and I. This won't take long, I promise. Did you know that I have a Ko-Fi? It's in the description of this video if you'd like to support me more directly. I spend a lot of time working on these videos, so it would be greatly appreciated if you could. Alright, that's all. Back to the video. Now, you likely have heard of the Dynasty Warriors series, but I'd be willing to bet you probably didn't know it started out as a 3D fighter. I really like Musou games, so it was interesting seeing these familiar characters recontextualized for a fighting game. The opening FMV is downright hilarious. It's so goofy and over the top. You know, people thought this was like the coolest thing ever in 1997. The character portraits too, oh my god. I love the PS1. Dynasty Warriors combat is fairly basic. You've got 2 attack buttons that string together to make combos, and 2 defense buttons. But these aren't your typical block inputs, they act more like a parry system. Basically, if you press the appropriate button in time with an enemy's attack, then you're granted an opportunity to inflict more damage. I do like this as a concept, but I think the combat is a bit too limited to make it feel properly rewarding to use. The movesets being comprised of basic attack strings means you'll be relying on the same moves a lot. Sidesteps are also in the game, but I found that they were way too slow to be used in most situations. And that's a shame. Implementing them in a more kinetic way could have added an extra layer to a pretty mediocre base moveset. Grabs are also rather inefficient. I found that most of the time they would kind of just not really connect. You know, overall I wouldn't really say the combat feels that bad, it's just a little button mashy and repetitive. You know, not great, not bad, just kind of in the middle. I think it would have benefited from having more attack buttons. Plus, with how awkward the sidestep is, I just don't really feel like this game needed to be in 3D. There's a super meter to spice things up, but I don't really know what they were going for with it. It kinda just goes up on its own and stops if you block an attack. Once it's full, you'll have until it goes back down to use a super or a Muso attack. It can also be used anytime you have low health. If you have both at once, then the super will be extended for more damage. I don't know how to feel about this. It's not necessarily a bad mechanic, it just feels like a very strange and rudimentary implementation of an idea that is pretty fundamental to the fighting game genre. Now, there's actually one aspect of this game that does shine above every other game in this video so far. It has a ton of content. Like with every other game, you have your standard arcade mode and versus. But then there's Team Battle, a game mode where 2 teams of 3 face off and try to eliminate the others. It's a bit similar to how Dragon Ball FighterZ is structured, the main difference being you can't switch between characters on the fly. If you wanted to though, you could play this mode with up to 6 people, and I think that's honestly pretty sick. The next game mode is Tournament Mode, which can be played with up to 8 people. I'm honestly shocked they thought to include an 8-player game mode here, but it's a very welcome addition. There aren't very many games on the PS1 that I think would make for good party games, but this is definitely one of them. Next up is a Time Trial Mode, which is basically just arcade mode, but it keeps track of the amount of time it takes you to finish it. It doesn't really add much to the game, but it doesn't detract from it either, so I'm fine with it existing. And finally, we have Endurance Mode. You know, you fight opponent after opponent, try to take out as many as you can, and your health bar is slightly refilled between matches. Survival Mode is a time-tested staple of fighting games, so I'm very glad that it's here. Dynasty Warriors is a bit of a tough call. It has pretty mediocre combat, the gameplay isn't overtly unique or interesting, but underneath that, I can see a pretty decent party game here. That's not something that too many PlayStation 1 games had to offer. So if you and a group of friends can look past the gameplay being a bit basic, then there's definitely some fun to be had with it. Released in 1999, Evil Zone was developed by UK's Future Media creators and published by... oh dear god. Titus Interactive? No, not the Superman 64 people! Well, okay, so far this doesn't look too bad. The opening FMV has a very strong anime aesthetic, and it's animated decently for the time. You know, I get the impression the animators actually cared when making this. Oh, there's a video tutorial that shows you how to play. That's pretty cool. Oh my god, why does the music go so hard? As I watched the tutorial, however, I quickly became aware of a horrible truth. This game has a single attack button, a single guard button, and that's it. You might be thinking, well, how does that work? Well, yeah, it doesn't. I mean, the general idea around the combat does have some potential. It's not like it's completely dead on arrival. The attack button is context sensitive. If you're far away from your opponent, then you'll fire projectiles. At close range, you'll perform a melee combo instead. You can change the type of attack you do by pressing a direction on the D-pad. And, yep. That's about it. I mean it, your moveset does not get any deeper than that. I guess you can jump? Not by pressing up, mind you. To jump in this game, you have to double tap up and then block. What? I don't know, maybe there's some really deep and intricate balance reason it needs to be that way, but for the life of me, I can't tell you what that would be. The health bars are on the side of the screen, which is a bit strange. I mean, there is a fundamental design reason for those usually being at the top. Even looking at it now, I can't really tell you what the reason for this is. Like, look at all the empty space in the upper portion of the screen. This layout just doesn't make any sense to me. The health bar itself does serve a secondary purpose, though. You can charge this yellow meter to full a maximum of 3 times. Doing so grants you a crystal. Charging it mid-fight is really awkward though. You have to press and then hold the attack button. But when you press it, the game thinks you're trying to attack, so you just end up punching the air every time you want to do this. Why couldn't this just be its own button? I sincerely don't understand. This game uses 2 buttons. 2! As your health decreases, the crystals are easier to obtain, which is a good idea on paper, but once you have the ability to spam these things, you become blatantly overpowered. I also really hate how long some of these animations can last. I mean, if somebody grabs you, it can take like 20 seconds for the animation to end. And that might sound big and dramatic, but these animations are so janky, it's impossible to take them seriously. Like, what's going on here? These two models could be f***ing for all I know. Oh my god, the story mode is my favorite part. The voice acting in this game is so funny.
See you next week on Passionate Majority. Round 2, Herculean Strength. And keep those cards and letters coming in, okay?
I can't even hear her voice under the music. And is that Comic Sans? Oh, the lip sync is so off too.
Did you stop Al? I have to thank you for that. Oh, it's nothing. I just wanted to fight a powerful guy like you.
I sincerely bursted out laughing every time I watched a cutscene in this game.
I'm not soft, so I'm not going to treat you as a little girl.
A little girl? After all, you're human. A human we hate very much.
What? Did they really make that her final voice? Like in the game? Like, was this game recorded in Logic Pro? What's going on? Oh my god. The game immediately cuts to the credits after you beat the story mode. There's no payoff whatsoever. This game is a complete mess, but it's honestly hilarious. I sincerely mean this. If I get enough requests, then I will upload every cutscene in this game to my YouTube channel. For now, though, I really need to stop playing this game. I will actually go insane if I spend another second looking at it. Okay, full disclosure before I start this section, I don't know anything about the Gundam franchise. I've just never really gone out of my way to interact with any of the media related to it. Not out of distaste for it, I just don't really know where to start. And something tells me this probably wasn't the best place. And it's because of that, I've decided not to quote-unquote review this game. I did write a review and fully planned on putting it in this video, but I want to explain why I scrapped it. As I said a few moments ago, I am not familiar with the source material. So I was tackling this purely as a video game and not an adaptation of a piece of media that I enjoy. I think there's a very important balance and distinction between those two ideas, so I didn't feel fully equipped to speak on this game in particular. And to be completely transparent, I did not enjoy this game. But shortly after writing it a negative review, I got curious and decided I wanted to take into account the opinions of actual Gundam fans. I read some personal testimonies, contemporary reviews from 2002, and even watched a few YouTube videos on it and scoured their comment sections. And apparently there are quite a few people out there who do cherish this game, and I was a bit taken aback by that. So I sat on it for a bit and ultimately decided to cut the review. I still wanted the game to be present in this video though. I am less interested in shoving my opinion down your throat and more so in showing things off that you may take a liking to. This game unfortunately wasn't for me, but that doesn't mean it won't be for you. It's far from being poorly made. So if you're a Gundam fan and you think this looks up your alley, then please, by all means, feel free to check it out. Okay, I promise I didn't bunch the 3 anime games together on purpose, the video just kind of turned out that way. But wow, this is a really impressive intro. For something that you're likely gonna skip every time you launch the game, it has a pretty insane level of effort put into it. That's a good sign right away. Getting into the game, I immediately started noticing similarities to Evil Zone, like a lot of similarities. The one that probably jumps out the most is the health bar being on the side again. Although this time it actually makes sense, since the entire screen is your arena as opposed to the lower 30% of it. There's a chargeable meter too. Once again, it grants you access to special attacks, but in this game they're less blatantly overpowered. Charging it has a dedicated button too. Thank God there's no more awkwardly punching the air. The combat functions very similarly as well, with context-sensitive attacks that change depending on the distance from your opponent. You know, you fire a projectile at long range and fight with melee when you're up close and personal. Despite the similarities, Psychic Force has much more going on under the hood. good. First and foremost, the movement is really interesting. There's no ground to speak of here. The fights take place in a 2D cubicle space that you're free to fly around as you choose. There's a dash mechanic too, which will either give you a quick burst of speed in a specific direction or hone in on your opponent. These homing dashes cancel out basic projectiles, so they're a great way to punish people who like to spam them. The dash feels great to use. Its inclusion alone is enough to make this game feel fast-paced and exciting. Once you're up close to an opponent, you can do some basic combos using the 2 attack buttons. Knocking an opponent against the wall will grant you a bit more damage and usually an extra hit. As expected, it's not the most robust thing in the world, but it's definitely way less awkward than having a single attack button for everything. Sometimes combos can be ended with a special attack that consumes some of your psi meter. However, unlike most fighting games, the inputs for your specials are not direction specific. So for example, if the input is a quarter circle on the D-pad, then the game doesn't really care which direction you do it in. This may sound weird at first, but it's actually pretty intuitive. I think it was definitely a necessary implementation considering how much you move around the arena in this game. If you find yourself getting harassed by an opponent, you can expel a bit of your meter to make yourself invulnerable while pushing them away. Otherwise, you always have access to a basic block. I like this inclusion too. Having more defensive options makes you think twice about being too aggressive during a match. In general, I think Psychic Force is a great example of how a game could be simplistic but still have depth. The moment-to-moment gameplay heavily emphasizes your decision-making, which makes for some pretty tense matches where you're trying to outplay your opponent. This game came out in 1997, 2 years before Evil Zone. Something tells me the developers of that game were definitely a bit inspired by this one. Call it a hunch though. It's actually kind of a cosmic coincidence that I somehow ended up playing both in the same video. If I did have one thing to criticize this game for, I think it would be the lack of game modes. There's story mode, versus, and arcade. That's pretty much it. I think this game could have benefited from at least having a survival mode. I mean, that's a pretty standard thing to ask for in a fighting game. Actually, no. There's one more thing I need to say about this game that really did not sit well with me. It was the voice acting. And no, this isn't your typical so bad it's funny kind of voice performance. It's more like, that needs to stay in the 90s. I'm not really comfortable playing any specific clips here, so let's just say that there are some really badly stereotyped accents. It's very uncomfortable to listen to. It didn't necessarily ruin the game for me, but I am throwing a fair warning out there that this is unfortunately a thing that exists. But, you know, from a purely gameplay perspective, I'd consider Psychic Force not only a distinct take on what a fighting game can be, it's an underrated gem in its own right. I had a ton of fun playing through it. I think this is definitely one to check out. Whew, alright, we're finally in the home stretch. This is a game that I've been meaning to check out for years. I've always heard whispers of Bloody Roar as this overlooked series that was taken from us way too soon. Within the first few seconds of starting a match, I was already blown away. I mean, this both looks and runs incredibly for a PS1 game. 60 FPS was seldom seen on the consoles, so I was completely shocked to see just how well this game was optimized for the hardware. The controls feel amazing too. Everything is so snappy and responsive. The pacing overall is way faster than you'd expect from a 3D fighting game on the PS1. Looking back at Battle Arena Toshinden, it's crazy how much the genre was able to progress in just 4 years, on the same console nonetheless. Now there's one sole gimmick that sets the Bloody Roar series apart from other fighters, each character's ability to transform into a different beast. And with this singular idea comes so many ramifications for the gameplay. The entire game is both balanced and designed around this mechanic. It's very unlike a standard super meter that you'd find in other games. While you're morphed, your moveset is better, your health bar regenerates, you can perform supers, it just puts you at such a massive advantage, which makes it seem like a no-brainer, right? Like just be in your beast form as much as possible. What's the point of ever being in human form if you don't have to? Well, there's plenty of reasons. Your human form may be objectively weaker, yes, but if you decide to morph early in the fight and your opponent manages to counter you while they're still in human form, then you'll really be in trouble. You only lose your secondary form if you take enough hits. It's not something that drains automatically. How long you get to use it is based entirely on your performance. So do you go all out right at the start of the fight, or do you save it for later when you might really need it? Do you transform only when your enemy transforms, or do you do it afterwards so that you might have the upper hand? There are so many different things to consider before utilizing this mechanic, and that's something I absolutely love. Before you've even started the match, you're already carefully considering how you should be using this valuable resource. And I think that makes makes for an amazing concept for a fighting game. Also, just a side note, notice how I got through that entire section without making a single joke about furries? Well, I kind of just undid that now, didn't I? But even aside from that, Bloody Roar 2 just has so much to offer as a 3D fighting game. The core moveset is one that's pretty simple to grasp, consisting mostly of sequential button inputs to form attack strings. It has 3 attack buttons, one of which is exclusive to your beast form, and inputs that don't feel too complicated or too simple. There are some very basic ones to get you started, but once you start experimenting with each character, it becomes quickly apparent just how many options there really are. And because the game's movement is so fast, it has a very heavy emphasis on spacing and timing, and in general just trying to pick the right move for the right situation. Then you start learning about different types of blocks, guard breakers, mix-ups. It becomes this really engaging experience of trying to outsmart your opponent at every turn. Out of all the games I've talked about in this video, I think Bloody Roar 2 feels the most rewarding to sit down and learn. And of course, it also has a bunch of content. Story mode, arcade, versus, survival, and a custom mode where you can set a variety of unique rules and even play practice mode. Man, this game is amazing. People really weren't kidding. This should be considered an all-time PS1 classic. I haven't played the other games in the Bloody Roar series, but making this video has fully convinced me that I need to. If you never have, you absolutely need to give this game a shot. So that was 10 obscure PS1 fighters that you hopefully haven't heard of. Like I said at the beginning of this video, some were more obscure than others, but I did my best to show stuff off that I'd either never played or never heard of. I grew up with a PS1, so this was definitely a much needed trip down memory lane. At least in some fashion. I always love going back to those low-res textures and low-poly models. If you enjoyed this video and made it this far, then thank you very, very much. The growth on this channel over the past 3 months has been completely unreal. I'll see you guys later.